Neighbors whispered it could not be real. Some said it was unpatriotic, dangerous, even treasonous to share food with the enemy. But in rural Georgia, hospitality ran deep, older than the war itself. And so the tables were set, the bread broken, the salt passed. For the prisoners, the shock was immediate. They had braced themselves for hunger, for punishment, for the endless monotony of barbed wire. Instead, they found themselves guests at family tables, treated with a courtesy that disarmed them more deeply than any weapon could. One POW later confessed in a letter smuggled home, "We sat in an American house as if we were their own sons. It was a meal that confused my soul more than the battles I had fought." The soldiers who guarded them spoke of it with disbelief, of hardened men bowing their heads as a farmer's wife led grace, of enemy hands trembling as they lifted forks beside American children, of eyes that could not decide whether to smile or to stare. It was not the battlefield, yet it felt like another kind of surrender. A surrender not forced by gunpowder, but by kindness. And so, in the quiet of the Georgia countryside, far from Rome, far from Berlin, far from the roar of cannons, the war twisted into something no general had planned. A war where food and fellowship became weapons, where the enemy tasted America not in blood, but in bread. By 1943, the United States was overflowing with prisoners. North Africa had collapsed for Mussolini, and tens of thousands of Italian soldiers laid down their arms. From dusty battlefields, they were shipped across the Atlantic. Men torn from deserts and villages, ferried under guard into the heart of America. Camps bloomed across the countryside, from Texas to Wisconsin, from Arizona to Georgia. The wire went up, the watchtowers stood. The uniforms were stripped of insignia. Yet within those fences lay an unexpected paradox. The enemy lived not in dungeons, but in the very soil of the nation they had been taught to despise. Georgia became one such place. A state of red clay fields, pine forests, and small towns still defined by church bells and Sunday suppers. The war had pulled young American men overseas, leaving farms short of labor. Italian POWs, considered less dangerous than hardened Nazis, were sent to work in orchards, fields, sawmills, and kitchens. They harvested cotton-picked peanuts, hauled timber. They sang as they worked, their voices strange to local ears, melodies from Calabria or Sicily, floating over the southern rows. Life in the camps followed a rhythm dawn roll call. Work details, supper, in the mess. But outside, the wire life in rural Georgia had its own rhythm: church on Sundays, long dinners that stretched into dusk, prayers before meals, stories traded across the table. Slowly, the two worlds touched. Farmers saw the Italians not as faceless enemies, but as young men with the same hunger and tired hands as their own sons at the front. Wives saw them not as threats, but as strangers far from home, polite and deferential. Children watched them with curiosity, fascinated by their accents, their gestures, their songs. The American government had not planned for this intimacy. Officially, POWs were to remain separate, confined, supervised. Yet the reality of rural labor blurred the lines. Italians who worked hard in the fields were sometimes invited inside for water, then for shade, then, astonishingly, for dinner. What began as quiet kindness spread by word of mouth until stories of the Sunday meal with the enemy became part of local lore. For the Italians, Georgia was bewildering. They expected hostility, and sometimes they received it: jeers and town suspicion from those who had lost sons overseas. But in the homes that opened their doors, they encountered something harder to reconcile: generosity. The war had told them America was decadent, soulless. Yet in the dim light of a farmhouse kitchen, passing a bowl of beans, they saw discipline, faith, and warmth that unsettled them in ways the battlefield never had. This was the context of 44 Georgia, an America torn between fear and hospitality. A South where the old rituals of Sunday dinners collided with the brutal machinery of global war. Within that collision, Italian prisoners became unwilling guests at tables where salt bread and blessing were shared, as if war itself could be paused for the space of a meal. The records are scattered, but they exist: lines of type in yellowing newspapers, paragraphs buried in government reports, fragments of testimony tucked into archives. They tell us with the bluntness of fact that in Georgia, 1944, Italian prisoners of war sat down to dinner with American families. Local papers such as the Atlanta Constitution ran human interest stories, short, almost quaint, about foreign guests welcomed into farmhouses for Sunday suppers. The language was careful, never too sentimental, but behind it ran a current of fascination. One article described how the prisoners removed their caps at the table, bowed their heads during prayer, and ate heartily, yet with an air of disbelief. Another column remarked that the enemy, once arrayed against our boys overseas, now shares cornbread and fried chicken in the kitchens of Georgia. Military correspondence reveals unease. Reports from camp officers acknowledged that farmers were inviting POWs into their homes, often after work details. Officially, it was discouraged. Civilians were warned not to fraternize. Yet in practice, discipline bent to necessity and custom. A War Department memorandum in 1944 noted, while regulations prohibit social engagement with enemy prisoners in rural areas, certain liberties have been observed. This practice has not resulted in adverse incident. The phrase was bureaucratic, but it captured the truth. The rule was broken, but no harm had come. Letters survive from Americans who hosted these men. A farmer in southern Georgia wrote to his son overseas, "You would be surprised, boy. They are not so different from us. Mama served them stew, and they thanked her as polite as any guest. They spoke little English, but their eyes told you enough they were grateful." Another family kept a POW sketch of their kitchen table drawn on the back of scrap paper, now preserved in a county historical society. From the prisoner's side, memories filtered back in smuggled notes or post-war memoirs. One Italian soldier recalled, "We thought we would die of hunger in the camps. Instead, one Sunday, I sat at the table of an American family. They gave me meat bread and wine. The children laughed when I tried to speak their language. I could not believe it. I was their enemy, yet they treated me as a man." The Red Cross inspection reports confirm the basics. Italian POWs in Georgia were fed well-housed decently, and unlike their German counterparts, often granted more leniency. Inspectors noted high morale, attributing it partly to the generous spirit of the local populace. Behind that sterile phrase lay countless meals, countless moments of shared humanity, never fully recorded, but undeniably real. Photographs are rare, but a few survive grainy black and white shots of men in plain uniforms, seated at farmhouse tables, women standing behind them, children staring into the camera. Their existence testifies to something remarkable, that amid the rigid machinery of war, families chose to preserve not the image of an enemy, but the memory of a dinner guest. Fact anchors the story clippings, reports, letters, and images that leave no doubt. In Georgia, 1944, the line between prisoner and neighbor blurred, not erased, but softened across the simple ritual of Sunday dinner. If the documents tell us what happened, the folklore tells us how it was remembered. Whispered in kitchens long after the war retold. In county histories passed between grandchildren who grew up hearing the strangest thing your great-grandmother ever did. In rural Georgia, the story of Italian POWs at Sunday dinners became a kind of legend. Some families claimed it was a test of Christian charity, that to deny food to a hungry man, even an enemy, would be a sin. Others swore it was nothing more than Southern hospitality, instinctive and uncalculated. But around porch swings and after church gatherings, the tale grew larger, embroidered with details that may or may not have been true. Children recalled the accent of the prisoners, how they spoke softly, fumbling English, sometimes breaking into song at the table. One girl interviewed in the 1980s said her mother always insisted the POWs blessed the meal more reverently than any guest they had ever known. Another memory claimed that one Italian soldier carved a wooden rosary for the farm wife who fed him, leaving it behind when he was transferred. Neighbors carried their own variations. Some swore that local girls found the POWs handsome, with dark eyes and courtly manners, and that chaperones were suddenly strict at those dinners. Others whispered of romances never proven, but always suggested as folklore loves to hint at forbidden connections. A few stories even told of POWs sending letters back after the war, thanking the families, sometimes enclosing photographs of themselves in civilian clothes, holding their own children. There were darker undercurrents too. Rumors spread that not all townsfolk approved. One version tells of a man who spat on the ground when he saw his neighbors seat Italians at their table, saying his son had died in Sicily and he would not share bread with the killers. Another legend tells of a POW who cried silently through an entire meal, overwhelmed by the kindness that contrasted too sharply with memories of combat and loss. In the decades that followed, the tales only deepened. At county fairs and local museums, old photographs of the Sunday dinners with the Italians were displayed like curiosities, proof that war could twist into unexpected forms. Folklore painted those evenings in soft hues, laughter over cornbread songs hummed in broken harmony, and the image of enemies transformed into almost family for a fleeting moment. What truly happened and what became embellishment is impossible to separate. But that is the power of folklore. It keeps the past alive, not by strict accuracy, but by resonance. The memory of Italian POWs at Georgia supper tables became less a fact than a parable, of hospitality that defied war of enemies who became men again when seated at a humble table of a South that turned the ritual of Sunday dinner into a kind of truce. Behind the warmth of those suppers was a framework, an invisible scaffolding of rules, policies, and pragmatism that allowed such improbable encounters to happen. The United States Army had inherited more than 400,000 Axis prisoners on American soil by 1944. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but Washington went further. It wasn't just law, it was strategy. POWs were divided by nationality, temperament, and perceived loyalty. Germans, especially dyed-in-the-wool Nazis, were considered hard cases, often kept in tighter camps. Italians, by contrast, were seen as more approachable, some even considered co-belligerents after Mussolini's collapse and Italy's surrender. To many Americans, Italians were not the fanatical enemy, but men caught in a war they no longer believed in. This perception filtered into policy, softening the edges of confinement. The War Department operated a system of labor contracts. Farmers desperate for help petitioned for POW laborers. Men in uniform arrived under guard, worked the fields, and returned at dusk. But in Georgia, the line between labor and neighbor blurred. Camp commanders, already stretched thin, often turned a blind eye if a farmer offered a prisoner water shade or even a seat at his own table. So long as discipline held and no escapes occurred. Reports labeled the arrangement satisfactory. There was calculation in this leniency. Military planners believed that treating prisoners decently weakened enemy morale, undercut Axis propaganda, and might encourage cooperation. By showing Italians the comforts of American life, food security, family warmth, freedom in miniature, the system hoped to plant seeds of doubt in hearts that had once followed Mussolini. This was re-education by experience, not by lecture. At the same time, the system relied on American cultural bedrock. In rural Georgia, Sunday dinner was more than food. It was ritual, faith, identity. Allowing a stranger, even an enemy, to share it carried profound symbolism. For the U.S. Army, this symbolism worked as propaganda made flesh. America not only fed its own, but even its prisoners with abundance and grace. The fact that civilians participated lent authenticity the government alone could never orchestrate. The Italian POWs themselves became part of this system. They were monitored, logged their work hours, recorded their behavior, noted. Yet within the neat columns of Army paperwork, the dinners stood out as anomalies, unofficial, unsanctioned, yet tolerated. Inspectors reported no adverse outcomes. To bureaucrats, that was enough. To the prisoners, it was life-changing. Thus, the system was paradoxical, rigid in structure, yet porous in practice. On paper, barbed wire and discipline. In reality, shared meals and fleeting bonds. The U.S. military never announced that Italian POWs should dine with civilians, but it allowed it quietly, because the results aligned with deeper objectives: control morale, and the projection of American strength through kindness. What emerged was not chaos, but a hybrid order. An order in which enemies were managed not only by fences and rifles, but by food ritual and the silent power of human contact. It was a Sunday in the spring of 1944 when the story reached its peak. A farmhouse outside Macon, its windows glowing against the evening dark. A long table laid with collard greens, cornbread, roasted chicken, sweet potatoes steaming in bowls. Around it sat a family in their Sunday best, children scrubbed clean from church, neighbors squeezed shoulder to shoulder. And there inconceivably sat half a dozen Italian prisoners, men in plain khaki, their faces still marked by sun and dust from the fields. The meal began in silence. The farmer's wife, hands folded, spoke the blessing, her voice steady, but her eyes flicking toward the prisoners as if to test them. To her astonishment, the men bowed their heads, murmuring their own prayer in Italian. A hush spread down the table. The children peeked, giggling nervously, until their father cleared his throat and broke the silence with the scrape of a chair. Plates were passed. The food was offered. Forks and spoons clinked. At first, the Italians ate cautiously, as if waiting for the moment to be revealed as some cruel trick. But then hunger overcame fear. One accepted more bread with a shy smile. Another gestured awkwardly in thanks. The family's youngest boy stared at a prisoner across from him, then with a burst of innocence asked if he had children too. The man paused, then nodded. His English was broken, but he pointed to his heart, whispered Bambino. Rome. The boy laughed, delighted, as though he had uncovered a secret. And then came the moment no one expected. The farmer's eldest daughter, who had learned a few words of Italian from her church choir teacher, sang softly an old hymn. Her accent clumsy, the tune halting. The prisoners froze, then one of them joined his voice, low but sure, carrying the melody as if lifting it home across an ocean. Another followed, and soon the farmhouse was filled with a strange harmony. Southern hymn entwined with Italian prayer, a chorus of voices that did not belong together, yet somehow did. The neighbors would tell the story for years. Some said the men cried as they sang. Others swore that the father of the house left the table to hide his own tears on the porch. Even the guards leaning against the wall lowered their rifles and listened, transfixed. For a few minutes, the war seemed to dissolve, replaced by something fragile and luminous. When the song ended, silence pressed close again. But it was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the silence after revelation. The silence that follows when men and women realize they have shared something too deep to name. The Italians bowed their heads. The family nodded. The guards shifted, uncomfortable. And the meal continued, but differently now, as if the enemy had vanished and only guests remained. Later, some would dismiss it as folly. Others would retell it as proof that faith and food could tame even war. But in that farmhouse on that Sunday night, the clash of worlds reached its climax, not in violence, but in a song that bridged the unbridgeable. When the war finally ended, the tables emptied, the camps dissolved, and the prisoners were shipped back across the ocean. Georgia's fields returned to the rhythms of peacetime, and the farmhouses stood quiet once more. Yet the memory of those Sunday dinners lingered, woven into both American and Italian lives, like a thread that would not fray. For the Italians, the meals became stories carried home, in letters and whispers to wives and children, in memoirs written decades later. They had expected cruelty, or at least indifference, from the enemy. Instead, they found bread, warmth, and kindness so disorienting, it unsettled them more deeply than combat. One man wrote years after his return to Naples, "I fought against America, But at a table in Georgia, I learned what America truly was. That meal stayed with me longer than the battlefields. For some, it became a seed of admiration, even longing that colored how they remembered the war. For the families in Georgia, the memory was equally haunting. Parents told children how the enemy had sat in their kitchen, bowed their heads at grace, and eaten cornbread beside them. Some remembered the laughter, broken English mixed with Southern drawl. Others remembered tears, the silence that fell when songs from two cultures met in fragile harmony. These stories became part of local lore, passed down like treasured secrets, always with a hint of wonder. We fed our enemies, and they became men like us. The U.S. Army, in its records, simply closed the files. Inspectors logged that Italian POWs returned peacefully, that morale remained high, that labor contracts had been fulfilled. Bureaucracy moved on. But in the private lives of soldiers and civilians, the experience remained luminous, resistant to paperwork's indifference. Guards who once stood with rifles recalled the evenings when they set suspicion aside to listen to voices singing in a farmhouse. Farmers remembered the look in a prisoner's eyes when he tasted food that tasted of home. Not all reactions were tender. Some neighbors never forgave the sight of Axis uniforms at American tables. They muttered of betrayal, of disrespect to the dead sons who had never come home from Anzio or Salerno. For them, the memory was bitter, a reminder that hospitality can wound as well as heal. But even in their resentment, they admitted the event had been extraordinary, something too strange to forget. Decades later, when oral historians gathered testimony, the POW dinners emerged again and again, shaped by nostalgia, guilt, pride, or quiet reverence. They were remembered not just as meals, but as moments when the war cracked open, revealing a fragile truth beneath that even in the shadow of global conflict. Even when uniforms marked men as enemies, the ritual of food could dissolve those barriers, if only for an hour. And so the aftermath was not measured in battles won or lost, but in memory. In Georgia, people spoke of those suppers as though they were miracles. In Italy, men who once marched for Mussolini told their children of the Americans who gave them bread. Between them stretched an invisible thread spun from kindness and disbelief, strong enough to outlast the war itself. The war ended. The tables cleared. But the echoes of those dinners remained half legend, half fact, wholly unforgettable. The war has long since ended. The barbed wire rusted away the camps, dismantled the fields of Georgia, turned back to ordinary harvests. But the memory remains, that in the midst of a world at war, enemies once sat together at tables, eating cornbread and chicken under the same roof as the families they had been taught to fight. What does it mean that kindness could disarm where weapons could not? Was it mercy? Was it strategy? Or was it something older, something deeper than politics, the stubborn belief that a man who shares bread with you cannot remain only an enemy? For those Italian soldiers, the memory never faded. For the Georgia families, it became a story passed down, part of the local lore, half fact, half legend, always tinged with awe. And for us decades later, it poses a question that lingers like the echo of a prayer before supper. If war can be softened, even for a night, by the passing of bread and salt, then what else might be possible if we dared to open our doors? You have just heard another file from the hidden archive of war. If you wish to continue uncovering the truths, prisoners, generals, and even nations themselves never fully confessed, subscribe now. Do not miss what comes next.